Welcome to Raising Joyful and Resilient Black Children. We're so excited to kick off season 3 and continue bringing you essential conversations about parenting, child well-being, and social justice. Our goal is to provide real tools, evidence-based research, and cultural wisdom that matter to Black families.
We are honored to have with us Dr. Brittany Friedman, a scholar and author of Carceral Apartheid: How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons. Dr. Friedman, welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for making time to chat with us and share with us your wisdom and your knowledge.
Okay, before we dive into the themes of your book, let's start with your journey. What inspired you with carceral apartheid, and how did you decide to take on this deeply complex and urgent issue?
Well, I really learned, the art of asking questions and pushing back against what you are told by my family members. So I grew up around a lot of strong women. My mom is the youngest of 12, and everyone's always telling stories and also teaching us to use our voice and don't just accept what you're told, whether it's coming out of a book, whether it's coming from a teacher. Using your mind is what you need to be here to do. And also, spreading the word about what you learn. And so for me, that kind of boils down to what does it mean to be a storyteller and to kind of follow your insights. And my insights led me to studying mass incarceration, but not so much as, what led to the mass incarceration of predominantly Black communities, but what happens to people when they become incarcerated? What is the story of protest that I saw in my own family and that I also learned, about the civil rights movement and Black freedom movement? How does that translate into prisons and how people are organizing against the state? And that kind of led me down this path of what eventually became carceral apartheid. But at the time, I didn't know that's what I was doing. And that's what I tell my kids and I tell my students. I'm like, you don't know where your ideas and passions will take you, or, the way that you're raised, it can translate eventually into you being the right person in the right place at the right time, right? Asking the right question. And I feel like that's what happened to me. But in all truthfulness, I did not know that this is where I would be.
Awesome. That's good advice for both your children as well as students who sometimes are not certain what they want to do or why they are passionate about particular topics, or even what we pick up from our family members. We don't realize that until we step into it fully. So thanks for sharing that little bit of advice for our parents and guardians of our children. As we dive into more questions about carceral apartheid, right? It exposes the deep-rooted ways in which prisons operate as tools of white supremacy. One of the things that really struck me was how the system doesn't just impact those incarcerated. It reverberates through our entire families and communities. Can you talk about how mass incarceration shapes the experiences of Black children and their caregivers?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, because of the system of racial profiling when it comes to police and the system of racialized sentencing laws, which target predominantly Black communities, our children are growing up in a world where for decades, their adults in their lives, right, their siblings, their caregivers are either directly impacted, meaning that they themselves have been incarcerated, or know someone that has been, or is importantly supporting someone who is incarcerated. And so what this does is it really reshapes the world of children in terms of seeing, one, that this type of state violence becomes normalized. We also know through research this type of state violence in particular with children causes a type of stress on the body and on the mind. And, we see this in sort of speaking to the children in our lives. And for myself, I have seen this in speaking to people that I organize with, that they themselves are directly impacted, meaning they're formerly incarcerated, talking about how their first experience with incarceration was actually the incarceration of a parent or a caregiver. And then as they are growing up and being funneled, especially through the school to prison pipeline, right, ending up becoming incarcerated themselves and having this moment of realization of like, wow, this is really how our society has fundamentally reshaped our communities, is using incarceration as this disciplining tool. And as it becomes a part of the life course, right? It's like, it becomes
Sure.
almost like
Unfortunately.
Exactly. It's like where a lot of people are like, oh, in my family, we all, hit this particular milestone and we're going to college. What we see now is that is what the state has decided is a milestone for many children of color, particularly Black children. And I want to emphasize that it is by design by the state, and that it is a lie that it is because of this like individualized nature, which is what, politicians, I would say corrupt teachers, the types of things that they say. It's like, oh, well, certain children are just this way. It's like, no, your system is this particular way it dates all the way back to colonialism and is designed to entrap students of color, in particular, Black students, Latinx students, and students that are indigenous are like, I think indigenous girls, for example, are currently like girls are like 4 times more likely to be incarcerated than white girls. And Black girls, I want to say it's either 2 or 3 times more likely to be incarcerated as a child. So it's insane.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a difficult topic. We often talk about the parents who are incarcerated, and then occasionally we hear about the legacy, this unfortunate legacy where we have parents who are incarcerated and later on their children become incarcerated. I mean, what does that mean to our community? And just helping others to be aware of how they are perceiving the behaviors and attitudes of children, particularly Black children and girls. Sheretta and I do that work. Really published quite a bit about, the needs of Black children and Black women and how Black girls are perceived. So I hear you. And certainly there is push out and other publications that have recently come out to really alert not just those of us who do the research, but practitioners and family members that it's not just your child and it's not just your family who's experiencing your child being funneled into a disciplinary school or being isolated or having a record that suggests that they are not cooperative and are not able to learn. So this idea that this is a system-wide experience is so important also to think about how it impacts children. So again, thank you for this book. And as we think about how difficult and challenging it is and really thinking about where children wind up, let's take a step back before we jump to another question. Talk about how some organizations have attempted to address it and whether or not you find those organizations, what are your thoughts about that? So we know, what are your thoughts about this? So I think about like Amachi is a program that's been around probably for at least 20 years or so. And that's a faith-based program, mentoring program for youth who have incarcerated parents. So I know that, there are lots of organizations, or there are some organizations like an Amachi, AMACHI, I believe, that works with the children and attempts to work with the family to prevent, this secondary impact where the children now become incarcerated. Have you come across organizations such as that who do that work, who attempt to mentor, attempt to bring and put supports around the families?
So, I think that this type of work is just so paramount. And I think that also what I think is super interesting is that, many organizations such as the one that you mentioned are addressing this issue twofold. On the one hand, providing safe spaces and support and the emotional and well-being support that children need, and then often the financial support, right? Because when a family member is incarcerated, it's removing, financial caregiving as well. And we know that particularly Black women, Black mothers, aunties, sisters, and grandmothers are the main providers of incarcerated men in particular, in terms of putting money on their books, driving to visit them. One of my students, I'll shout her out. Her name is Raquel Delerme. She's also an amazing Black woman scholar. And that's what she did for her thesis. And it was an honor for me to supervise her thesis, but she was writing about, this cost, this financial cost and the emotional cost, and how it is falling predominantly in the United States on Black women to support their incarcerated loved ones. And so I think that organizations that are, stepping in, and when families are experiencing this type of shock, because it's a shock to the family system, And then also, I've seen some really great work of organizations just like targeting the school policies themselves, certain school policies that we know significantly contribute. Like I think that twofold aspect is key because we really also, have to abolish these particular school policies that other our children, that, bring in the police for something that, like, when I was a little kid, it was like you might speak to like the school counselor, but nowadays I'm learning like the police come and they will arrest a child for something that, like, I'm like, really? When I was a kid, you go speak to the school like counselor, and then they like, and you just go back to class. That's what it's not an escalation of like, we're going to bring in the cops and like handcuff so and so and take them away, and they're like a baby.
That's true. How significantly the process of really caring for a child, educating them, and the social aspects that come along with being educated in community have certainly changed. And so thinking about that and using your text, your book, as a way to help people see that this is indeed systematic. Thanks for that. And then also thinking about organizations like an Amachi, which is How to Build Up Your Pennsylvania, where they've been working for quite some time to partner children of incarcerated parents with someone from the community, and really to, as you said, to not only have that adult caring person, ideally who's from their community and can relate to them, but also to help them, process what it's like to have that isolation or maybe, just think through what it means to have a parent or parents who are incarcerated. So we know that there are other organizations who are doing that work. And I just happen to know that one has been around for quite some time.
Yeah. And we have an organization here like that as well, Soul Fisher Ministries, where they actually work with children who have incarcerated parents. They work with the school district. They sort of collaborate to make sure all the needs are met, that children don't feel sort of misplaced. They also take them to see their parents. So it's a lot. It's a lot that just goes into that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it made me think about this organization that's pretty strong here in St. Louis too.
Yeah.
And so, Dr. Friedman, you write about the deliberate suppression of Black political movements within prisons, starting as early as the 1950s. And so what are some of the lasting consequences of this for today's Black youth, especially when we think about the broader criminalization of Black children in schools and communities, something you just brought up, like with discipline and, not being able to go to the counselor's office no more, the police being right there. What do you think about that?
So I love this question because the question itself showcases how what I study in terms of how protest behind bars is criminalized and how it gets people disappeared by the government, how it gets people tortured and solitary in a label that follows them, right, even outside of prison. What that also translates to is the fact that, law enforcement across different levels, they're also talking and sharing information. And what I have found in my work is that these labels or these like threat identifications that departments of corrections come up with, they follow people even when they get out and they go home. And then local law enforcement takes that threat assessment and then that assesses that to an entire neighborhood. And so what this is really showing is that my work shows that really the history of criminalizing protest, you can find a lot of police tactics in how they treated people when they were incarcerated and in terms of how political prisoners are treated. And so what it does in the current moment, it's that kids, especially in school settings, in any sort of public setting, and teenagers and adults that are protesting against police violence, that are protesting for Black Lives Matter, are at a particular risk of being, labeled by the state using criminal labels to criminalize protests. And then that puts them at risk of being arrested for civil disobedience or for taking to the street. And here in LA, we had so many kids that have been taking to the street to protest Trump's orders and the mobilization of ICE in schools against children. And, taking to the streets. And what is, I would say, has like scared a lot of parents here is that, we know that like the police, they will treat children as adults when they're interacting with them. And that the criminalization of protests, it allows the government to charge people with crimes simply for exercising free speech. And so that's something that I have really learned in my work is that, free speech is not, even though it's a constitutional right, it's not applied evenly in terms of who's allowed to talk. And that even applies to children.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so I think that's so important. And that relates to our next question that I really am interested in hearing your response to, and really thinking about, one of your central themes is how deception and disinformation are used to maintain carceral control, right? And you just talked about, freedom of speech not being equivocal. So many Black parents raise their children in a world where they must constantly navigate misinformation about history, law enforcement, or even their rights, as you just mentioned, freedom of speech. How can families really equip their children with the tools to recognize and to resist these false narratives? And how do we talk to our children who are deciding that, they are going to protest, that they're going to show up because they recognize that there's some inequalities and some challenges that they want to speak up against? So what are some things that parents can do to equip their children with the tools and help them to resist false narratives while at the same time exercising their rights?
So, I can start with things that I have taught my own children and other children in my life, my sister's kids, because I'm the third child, the middle child of four. There's four of us. And, for me, it has been just really important to instill one in my children that, just because someone's telling you something about you doesn't make it true. And telling them very much saying I ask them so common, very frequently, actually, how are you feeling about yourself? What's going on at school? How are you feeling with your friends? And through these conversations, we usually do them at night, around story time, because I'm creating a space for conversation because we're reading books. And they will tell me things. They will tell me things their friends say to them, things that people might have said about their hair, people might have said about their skin tone. People say these things. And then I ask them, I think having these open dialogues, it allows your child to, I've had my children, they're little bitty kids, and break down in tears because of something someone said about their hair. And I feel so grateful that I asked them. And I think that asking our children questions and helping them reframe their experiences so that they can see that, one, what's happening is because of someone else's ignorance, prejudice, because of someone else's ideas about you and design. It's not because of who you are. And that's something that, it's important to me because that's something I've learned over the years as an adult from having amazing friendship with other Black women. And also just in my life, having people do that for me. And I realized with my kids at a young age that reframing is so powerful because then it helps them not let certain things in. And it's you can't prevent everything from not getting in, but it helps them have the tools to be oh, that's a projection. I'm not these things that the teacher is assuming about me because of the way they treated me or because of or whatever this classmate said about me or my parents. I can just say that has been, I feel the game changer in our household. And it also has taught me a lot about my kids' lives. It's I feel there's a whole social lives of kids. They're very little. Yeah. They got a whole thing.
There is.
There's playground politics.
There is. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. And because of the way these policies show up in our communities, in our schools, those politics may have different implications for Black children and youth, right? So we know, or we've talked about here and there, mostly we talked about, elementary age children, but also there's the research that talks about the expulsion of preschool children, right? And so Black preschool children specifically. So those politics do have these implications and are very much related to this idea of, this carceral punishment, right? This idea of starting young and using carceral apartheid to control the behavior and the life outcome, the life course of Black children and Black families. So absolutely. Yeah. Tough topic, but something to consider when we're thinking about the tools and the resources that we share with our children.
That's right. And then also you brought a little bit, even though you said it at the end around this idea of socialization. And so that leads into the next part where, your book exposes hidden histories and suppressed truths. How can storytelling, whether through books or history or media, be a tool of resistance and healing for Black families raising the next generation? This idea of sharing and storytelling.
Yes. Okay. So I love this question. I'm smiling big because the greatest storytellers of my life were my grandparents. So in my book, I talk a lot about my grandma, and like I love my grandma so much, and she's still here. She's around because I have an ancestor altar. So she's still
That's
around.
right.
But like I just have all these fond memories of going to the Boot Hill with my parents since I grew up in Jeff City, and then going down to the Boot Hill and being there with my grandma, and then she'd tell us all these stories. And then my grandpa, like my grandparents eventually separated, and he went to Portland, to be with his family out there that had left Mississippi during World War II. And so even with him, when I go see him, he would just tell me all these stories of like growing up in Mississippi. He told me about how our family inherited our farm, which was the first time I really learned about the violence of slavery, like truly learned about it in terms of like a story that would have not been allowed to be told like in my school. But my grandpa is like telling me about this, and he's like, and he's showing me pictures because we have all these old pictures that are like, some of them are pre-Civil War. And he's like, yeah, that's your ancestor. That's your ancestor. This is like, and then he even had a picture of the white slave owner that owned our family. Like he had a photo of him, and he's like, that's him. That's the McMichael family. And I was like, just like things that now our government is trying to ban in history books, like my grandpa laid out in his storytelling. And so I think that sitting down with our children and really being like the community historians, right? Embodying that. I know that most people have somebody in their family that was like the keeper, that kept the stories, that may have written them down, that shared them in a family setting. And not all the story, like the stories that my grandfather shared me, they're hard to hear, but they're incredibly powerful because now I know who I am. So like nobody can tell me anything about me, my community, where I come from, my place in the world. And I feel like I have a sense of confidence that was instilled in me because my grandparents made sure I understood our history. And so I do think we can do that now. And kids, they can learn at a very young age. Just pull out the family photo album. That's a way of being your family historian and your community historian.
Yeah, I think that's so important. But really, some families have gotten away from storytelling in that way. And we think about something as painful as incarceration. How do we encourage children and families to tell that part of the story as well? So what you're sharing with us, Dr. Friedman, is your personal experience with storytelling and how that helped to ground you in your identity, the strength and resilience of your family, like the rawness of this really was an experience my family had and not just a textbook story of slavery and freedom. So when we think about incarceration, whether it's a child who starts out in juvenile justice or a child whose parent has been incarcerated their entire or half their life, how can we move into, what are your thoughts about how do we move into helping them to tell that story as well? Because that can be a difficult story to tell or to acknowledge, even though it's something that they're ever aware of, but also important. So how do we move into a place of saying, tell this story as well?
I think that we have to create a space where there is no judgment, because I think that in any sort of truth-telling environment, it's shame is going to be the emotion that really often prevents people from wanting to be seen or to share their story because of a fear of that sense of being, diminished for your experience or for having it be individualized in the sense of, well, you're a bad person because you went away. And so I think that like healing starts with the truth. That's something I learned in my journey as a spiritual herbalist, is that true healing can only come about with the truth, and it really merged my worlds as someone who is always, writing about truth telling and what does that mean? And then learning practice in the healing arts of like, okay, well, how do we create those containers? And so I do think that it is approaching the container without judgment and compassion and grace. And that's something I also learned in the process of writing my book. Like when I'm talking to people about their life stories, I always try to create a container of peace so that no matter what's shared, I'm not here to cause any harm. Like, I'm here because I'm curious. And that's something I think we can do in our own families, is have a sense of curiosity about people's experience, and kind of like, I don't want to use the word detach, but it's like, even when I ask my mom about her life, for example, I try to like step out and just like treat my mom like she's just like a person, like she's a human being. And I'm trying to understand, like, her experiences, because I want to know her better, versus being like, this is my mom, because it has a whole attachment to it that can maybe prevent me from seeing her as like a woman, right? As a Black woman, I could just see her as like, that's my mom. And I think when we're talking to our family, about things that are hard, very hard, like hard traumas like incarceration, it's like just stepping back and being like, okay, if this person was my friend, how would I approach them if I wanted to understand them?
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. And just seeing us as human, and often the humanity is taken away or out of the lives of Black people and Black children, and definitely when incarceration is involved, right? So it's just seeing people as human, as whole people, and trying to understand what their experiences is important. And seeing people as whole and human, particularly children, because they're growing, right? And they're learning from themselves, from the others, from other people, should I say, from their family members. And we're also trying to nurture them, right? So whether they're incarcerated or not, we're also nurturing children. So when we think about how we nurture children in this space, we're talking about their physical selves, right? In this place where they can be incarcerated, or we want to prevent them from being incarcerated. How do we care for them in a healthy way? So what are some health-oriented tips for caring for our children, knowing that as parents, we're often navigating dynamics, contexts, and situations to, one, acknowledge to our children that they're human, and two, to just help them to be healthy and whole. So what are some practical ways that we can be reminded and remind our children that they're healthy, they're whole, they're human? What are some healthy tips that you might have for our parents to keep that in mind for themselves, but also in how we care for and nurture our children?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can share some things that I do with my own kids, because those are things that I definitely can stand by, that have been transformative for us, And so for me, as I allude to a little bit in prologue of the book, like, I grew up country, so I'm used to being outside and my mom, like, us running around for hours in the woods, and her being like, you can come back later. And she really meant it.
Right.
So
Right.
that has, like, I have, definitely have I would say a love of the outdoors, but it's something I've realized, I think, for everyone. And I realized this with my children, right? We're growing up in a city, even though we moved outside the city now, as we were talking about earlier, like we moved a little farther out, but I still am like, wow, like, I want to cultivate within them a sense of like, that when we really return to nature, there is a sense of peace. And there is a way that we can ground and find, safety and a sense of internal rhythm that gives us peace no matter what chaotic thing is going on. And that's something I have learned, and I didn't realize I was learning when I was running around climbing trees and all these different things. But it's like, I think, research shows now, a lot of really amazing research in the natural sciences shows that, like, trees actually, they talk to each other, and they are very social beings. And I grew up hugging trees just because I was outside all the time. And sometimes I did want to come inside and get water, which I do tell my mom now, like, you should have at least given us a water bottle because we were dehydrated.
But are you telling your mom that you missed out on this current craze of water bottles that these young children are into? Are you telling your mom you missed out on Stanleys?
Yes, I don't even know what a Stanley is, because I feel like if I tried to go inside and get water, we would get in trouble because we were supposed to be outside. But I do feel like now with my kids, for instance, I have taught them, like, if they're feeling overwhelmed, I'm like, let's go outside and go barefoot and walk around. Because that's just something I did that used to bring me peace. But the more I read about it, I'm like, oh, scientists are showing, like, when you walk barefoot, it really does transform your entire emotional and spiritual and physical state. And you do become synced into the rhythm of the earth. And so I think that, I know something I love about this is because it's also simple. It's also simple. And I think it also is very revealing because if you look at, for example, the historical devastation of our communities through gentrification and through the construction of major highways, through all of these famous Black neighborhoods, what they're actually doing is taking away our green spaces. They are taking away all of these connection to the outdoors, all of these connections, creating food deserts. But that's another big thing that I think is important is that it's taking away our connections to the trees, our connection to the plant. And that is, at least for me, it's a big way I connect with my ancestors. And my grandma had her garden. I used to love seeing her in the garden. And she's the one who taught me to talk to plants. She used to talk to her plants. So now with my kids, I try to take them outside whenever, at least once a week. We try to go to the park, try to go somewhere. But I very much realize that that's a privilege because now we live in a world where in many Black communities, parks are gone, pathways are gone to go for walks, or it's physically unsafe to walk around in certain parks because of the level of surveillance by law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And law enforcement, and unfortunately, sometimes the violence that's also occurring in our communities. Mm-hmm. But I would say, we can do house plants, right? We can dance. One of the things that I often say, which will lead me to our next question for you is, I would say, be safe, dance, laugh every day, just really harnessing joy, right? And even being close to the earth, as historically, for many in the Black community came as a result of toiling in the soil, unfortunately as slaves and then as sharecroppers. But this idea of being close to the earth, but then also, moving away from that. So thinking about that reminds me of our earlier question to you around the history, the hard history. So there's the hard histories associated with slavery. There's the hard issues or the hard stories associated with slavery and incarceration. But then there's the joy quotients, what I call joy quotients. So really thinking about, planting, as you said, watching your grandmother. And for those who may not have a grandmother in their household, but are there community members who you can relate to? Are there ways that you can connect? So maybe if it isn't gardening for you, what could it be? And that allows you to connect with your children and disconnect, as we've heard quite often as well, from the digital spaces, right? So turning off the TV, not playing a virtual game, stepping away from virtual reality. What are those ways? So super important. I'm a gardener, so I'm on board with the gardening and the house plants, but certainly thinking about what are the other ways I connect? Is it teaching my child how to play cards? I probably shouldn't say on record, but I don't know how to play spades, right? But I sit and I watch. But I can play Uno and I play 500. Don't shame me, Sheretta. Don't shame me. I'm human. But these things that I learned from my uncle. I learned how to play these other games with my uncles and my dad, right? Because that was a big deal in my family. My uncles and aunts would come and play with my mother and father cards. So the ways of being that we might be able to recall from our history, our family's history, sound like one of the ways that you connect with your children, both now and in the present, but also connect them to the history of your family. Super important. Thank you for sharing that. We do always like to end our conversations by focusing on action, right? So we understanding what the challenges and the opportunities are in front of us, how this carceral apartheid is systematic and not just an instant, right? And that there's a history and legacy to that. And then we also talk about the ways of documenting and being whole, allowing people to be whole, both the children as well as the parents who may experience incarceration. So what about some actions? What are some practical ways that parents and caregivers who are listening to us today, or even those community members who are stepping in as mentors, formal or informally, right, can take and just manage to challenge the harms of mass incarceration and support families affected by it? So let's say they're not in a formal program, but they want to step up. What can they do? What can people in the community, family members do to support those children?
So something that I have seen in the writing of Carceral Apartheid is that really as a system, one of the main ways that it seeks to target families is through censorship of information. As we've been talking about, censorship of history, of knowledge of ourselves and feeling connected, right, to our own histories and our histories in a positive light, and rejecting this framing of our history through a state lens or through a white supremacist lens. And so something that I have seen, in my community here in LA that's been very powerful, we have book shares. So amongst parents, we're like recycling books amongst us has been super powerful in having conversations. So across families, having like a little kid book club, essentially. That's not what we call it, but I'm like, maybe we should. Because it's like, because I feel like the kids are, so proud of like to talk about like, this is what I read and like, this is what it means to me. And it promotes like critical thinking about subjects. It is like kids are seeing other kids do the same. So there's a positive mirroring that's happening. So I would say like in your own community, it's like, why not start a little kid book club, right? Why not really nurture that and then have like a book share where books can be shared across. And also there's many authors who will donate books. Like if you ask them, they will donate copies of, whether it's like their children's book or a book that, could be adapted for children with adult support. There's many authors that really will and that is something, I myself, for example, I'm going to be doing some meetings soon about getting my book into certain libraries that may not have the budget to acquire my book, but I am going to meet with them and see how I can fundraise to get the books there, right? Or to work with my publisher to get a deal to get my book in the library. Thinking of how we can exchange knowledge with our kids and other families in a way that very much mirrors like mutual aid and then is uplifting. And I like the little kid book club idea. I'm going to take that back. I'm going to say this needs to be called a book club to like tell the kids like this is official. This is a book club and y'all are big kids and you're reading and sharing, even if they're little like 7. But it's like, I just think it also gives them a sense of pride in what they're doing. And that's important for kids' confidence.
Absolutely. So starting a book club, having these reading circles, sharing information, and also connecting with the other parents in your community. And for some of us who may be, or some of our listeners who may be more introverted or say, I don't know anyone in my community, because communities look different and they move different from how they did in prior generations. So just making the effort to connect, which is a big part of the conversation happening right now within Black communities, connect with people on the ground, right? So that might mean that you have to go and introduce yourself or have your children go play with a child across the street or down the street in order to begin to develop these types of relationships where you can bond around books. You might even bond around food. You might bond around healthy cooking and, healthy snacks for kids, or you might bond around music. But this idea of bonding in community. So I hear you saying bonding with your own children, but also bonding with others in the community as a way to tell stories and make sure that all of the stories and all of the parts of the experiences of these families who may be affected by incarceration, whether it's directly by a family member or knowing someone down the street or witnessing it, just being able to tell the whole story and also to be whole. And so bonding allows us to remember that we are human. So thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. So we do want to thank you so much for sharing your own experiences, anecdotal as well as the book, and really highlighting this long-standing legacy. So again, those families who are experiencing it can understand that these things are systematic and begin to think about how do we address this, as well as how do we have these important conversations and sometimes difficult conversations with our children. We do want to thank you for joining us and sharing all of your valuable insights into how we can move beyond, just talking about the incarceration, what that looks like, but these healthy experiences that can help us around exercise and getting moving and playing in the dirt to promote holistic wellness for Black families. We are so appreciative of the book that you've chosen to write and to share with us, as well as practical tips for just being healthy in this moment or in these moments that can feel very heavy.
Yeah. And I also want to say one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation is creating space for those who may have been formerly incarcerated in our families, and how do we sit and talk about them. And it really resonated when you was like, just speak to them without judgment and creating a space where that can happen. And I think it's a lot of shame and stigma associated with that. And I think that's something we got to work through. So that is really what resonated with me. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. And just listening to the whole story. Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Thank you. Thank you. So we're Dr. Valerie Adams-Bass and Dr. Sheretta Butler-Barnes. We thank you for listening, and we'll see you on Raising Joyful and Resilient Black Children next time. Thank you.
See y'all. Thank you.